Good evening and welcome to Slam the Gavel, the show that tells you all regarding family court, other court issues, as well as CPS. I am your host, Maryann Petri. You can find me, my books, and blogs on dismantlingfamilycourtcorruption.com, as well as on Amazon. Also, my books are on audio as of 2 weeks ago. I have two return guests. I have Dr. Bandy X. Lee on. She was last on season 4, episode 23, and season 5, episode 249, as well as Evelyn Hemphill, season 5, episode 98, and 125. And today we're going to talk about psychological tests and forensic evaluations that Evelyn has done. And we want to show people what goes on in these family courts and how these are used against the targeted good fit parent in these corrupt family court systems. I welcome you both to the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
I'm glad to have you because people need to know what's really going on. And Evelyn, how do you
Yes,
want to proceed? Because you've got these evals.
I can, however Dr. Lee would like to proceed, I can try to
Okay.
answer any questions or engage however I need to.
Okay.
Yes, since everyone will be new to your story who haven't listened to your podcast, perhaps, would you like to give a brief summary of what has happened and how you have come to be evaluated?
Yes, ma'am. I was a domestic violence survivor and sexual assault survivor in a divorce case. I ended up having an affair because of all the bad treatment that I received within my marriage. I retained multiple attorneys. I stayed in court for maybe 12 years, I think, for the whole duration of the process. I was scammed out of over $100,000 by the court system. There's no way for me to be reimbursed according to the state of South Carolina. And during that time, I kept going back in trying to fight for custody of my minor child at the time. And the court started to request me to take psychological exams because I would not give up the fight.
Would they require psychological testing of your ex-husband?
I believe it was yes, yes, but
In addition to
not
the custody
initially.
evaluation?
Not initially. It was only me being
Mhm.
tested. But
That's
then,
correct, yes.
yes, ma'am, and I had an attorney that I had to practically beg to go back before the court for the other party to be tested.
Okay, yes, that is very typical. Usually the one bringing the allegations of abuse and who is the domestic violence survivor presents their accusations, which are generally true. This needs to be emphasized with the public that the false report rate is something like 0.1%, and especially lower among women. And yet their accusations are considered to be almost universally false in family court, and they're evaluated to be mentally impaired in some way. And usually it's the perpetrator who has a personality disorder or other mental health problems, but they are generally excused from any kind of evaluation. So please go ahead.
Well, initially, the first exam I was ordered to take, it happened, the date of service is January the 10th and the 16th, 2017. And that psychological assessment came back stating that I was a battered wife and I had no significant psychological issues.
Yes. You were evaluated by a trauma specialist, I understand.
This was a counselor. That's what the order stated. And I complied with the order. I went and found the counselor. My attorney did not locate anyone for me. I was ordered to do it, even though I had legal representation.
Yes, and it seems you found someone with a doctorate degree who had clinical training and had become a licensed professional counselor who had trained in psychological testing and was a trauma specialist. I saw
Yeah,
his report, and his report, although short, seemed believable that you had had post-traumatic stress disorder in the past, now were in remission and had no psychological barriers to effectively parenting your child.
that's correct.
Mhm.
And I do have one question. Was I supposed to be exposed to the same type of test 2 times?
Um, Usually, if licensed professional has clearly stated that you have no barriers to being able to parent your child, then that should be able to conclude for the court that there are no red flags. But of course, family court operates differently from most courts. It sounds to me from the history of your case that you are a clear victim of domestic violence and your child is a clear victim of child abuse by your ex-husband. And this should have been a matter resolved within days, if not hours, in a criminal court. But because this is in family court, it has dragged out for 12 years, you said?
Yes, ma'am. Now the
Yes.
child will be 21 years old, but I'm still speaking out because it happened. And I
Yes.
want to help other people to be aware when these courts order you to take these tests, even though there's nothing wrong with you, the courts have the power to have you tested time and time and time again, even though the results will not change.
Yes. They are actually fishing for results that they would like. Because the problem with family courts is that their appointed experts are seldom independent. They have their own pool of usually poorly qualified professionals. But since the United Nations and various medical bodies have um, spoken up about how they need to uh, hire more than a mental health counselor or an associate counselor to be their so-called expert, they've recruited more psychologists, doctorate psychologists, and psychiatrists, which is extremely distressing that even that level of training would not be a safeguard against their being compromised and corrupted by the family court. The problem with family court is that the incentive to do the wrong evaluation is so great and the reward so high because, as you know, these are very high stakes cases that actually should be in criminal court,
Mhm.
where there's no chance of the accused to be able to frame the victim and to reverse their accusations and make you the abuser and exonerate themselves. This is precisely what family courts end up doing because there's so much profit in rendering the wrong ruling. And so they're actually very typical. Among the 50 or so family court cases I've been involved in, I have only encountered one case that went in the right direction. And after an extraordinary fight, an extreme injury to the child that was absolutely undeniable, but even in cases where there's extreme injury, family courts, because they determine what counts as evidence, who counts as an expert, they determine which kind of evidence to leave out. And lo and behold, there are cases where they leave out dozens of highly qualified experts, whereas they only take the determination of an unqualified mental health counselor in one case that I've seen in Wisconsin. But it's nationwide.
Well,
Um,
after this,
so so my assessment is that they required you to get a second psychological evaluation, even though there's no evidence of any kind of impairment or any barrier to your parenting, so that they can reverse the evaluation, count only the one that favors their predetermined outcome, and to give the child to the abuser. That is the usual formula.
yes, that's exactly what happened. and I had to pay for these tests. This was a private case. So I not only did I have to struggle and go and find this counselor that is well qualified, the opposing counsel questioned the credentials of this counselor, but still didn't have to submit any evidence to the court that this person was not qualified to do this first assessment. I'm still waiting years later. Where is the evidence that this initial person was not qualified? There is no evidence.
So usually the recommendation I give to litigants is to try to avoid the court-appointed evaluator, because the court-appointed evaluator, even though they're supposed to be neutral because they're court-appointed, are actually the exact opposite. They're extremely compromised and non-neutral. They're protected because the court protects them, but I've seen the most unbelievably unprofessional, fraudulent evaluations come out of these court-appointed evaluators, and yet they are not held accountable because judges protect them. Judges want them in order to state that they are hinging their decisions on expert testimony, when in fact the expert is simply providing a rubber stamping to the judge's predetermined ruling. It actually started with Richard Gardner in the 1980s, who invented this parental alienation syndrome, and it has taken off in different names and different variations, but he invented a syndrome that does not exist in the rest of psychiatry so that he could please the courts. And he stated that child sexual abuse is virtually non-existent. The children are predators who basically entice adults into having sexual encounters with them, even if they're 4 or 2 years old. And he himself stated that false allegations are, or the majority, and that actual sexual abuse occurs 2 in a million cases, whereas in fact it's about 1 in 5 children are sexually assaulted. And so it started with his excuse of sexual abuse of children, which extended into all forms of abuse. And he was, even though he was not able to publish any articles with respected scientific journals or publishers, he had to create his own publishing company to produce his own literature. He was employed by the courts 400 times because he was willing to reverse everything and state that the symptoms of trauma are actually symptoms of mental illness, that and signs that the child should not be with that parent. And that continues to this day. After Richard Gardner died in a gruesome suicide, he had serious psychiatric problems. The family courts still continue, almost 50 years into this, to try to find experts who will parrot his narrative that the victims are the actual perpetrators and child abuse does not exist, and the children should be taken away from the victim parents.
I believe you've just answered my question about the state of South Carolina.
Mhm.
They must go by his reports,
Yes,
his
it's
research. Okay,
yes, because it originated in family courts. It
okay.
is not a known diagnosis or phenomenon according to psychiatry or psychology. In fact, multiple medical associations, professional organizations have denounced the use of parental alienation. Basically, parental alienation means that the abuse allegations are false. They're intended to alienate a good parent when allegations of abuse are made, when in fact the vast majority of allegations of child abuse are true, especially when made by the mother. In fact, almost. The problem is underreporting, not overreporting. But in
Because
family court, they're
nobody
taking.
will believe the victim most of the time. They paint this picture of the victim that's telling the truth. I have 2 psychological assessments here. One is a forensic psychological exam. On the original test, it states that I tell the truth. On the second one, it states that I tell the truth.
Yes, it states that you have told the truth, and yet it concludes in very vague language how you have anxiety, which is, of course, post-traumatic stress disorder is an anxiety disorder. But instead of dealing with the source of the anxiety, in other words, stop the abuse,
Mhm.
they have said that you probably need psychiatric treatment, probably need to be on medication, and do not address the problem with the abuse.
And
So,
I would like to say this. I did not get on psychiatric medication because I didn't need any psychiatric medication. So I did not go by that portion of that report. I'm still not on any psychological medication. Why would I take medication that I don't need?
yes, that is their way of creating a problem where none exists in order to take your children from you. It is an extremely unfortunate practice of what I call anti-courts, because family courts are not courts in the conventional sense, in that they do not follow constitutional requirements of due process, they do not follow rules of evidence, and they usually they have no jury, it's only one judge, and they usually seal the case. So there is absolutely no public scrutiny or oversight. And because the practice, which is actually criminal practice, is so lucrative, amounting to $50 to $175 billion per year, family courts bring in more revenue than all other courts combined, which is truly astonishing. And that is done through taking children from good, fit parents and giving them to their violent perpetrators.
That's a sad thing. That's very sad.
And
Yes.
these incentives also funnel into the judges' pensions. I don't think a lot of people know that as well. This is a big kids for cash scheme, and it needs to be abolished.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a great way to put it. It is a kids for cash scheme that is no parallel to the Pennsylvania judges,
Huh.
because
Yeah.
these children, of course, are damaged for life.
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah.
So
And oh, go ahead.
no, I'm very sorry for what has happened to you, but perhaps it can help to have confirmation that this is now a well-known phenomenon occurring throughout the country in all 50 US states. And the US has exported this method, this playbook, to the world, to the point where the United Nations Human Rights Council has reported on it as a public health emergency.
Oh
Mm.
my God. And it is. And the only way I'm able to discuss anything about this case today is I had to become a pro se litigant. I had to remove all of the legal players out of the way because a lot of information was suppressed. My own attorneys would not bring forth the truth for me. So I found a loophole where I was able to remove those attorneys out of the way. And I went and represented myself for 4 days in family court, and I filed an appeal. They sealed the family court information, but they cannot seal the public information that was filed in the Court of Appeals in South Carolina.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And you did find out that many of the attorneys are actually not helpful because, well, family court has been doing this for a very long time, and either you play along or you are removed or punished or even disbarred.
Mhm.
Even judges who have spoken up about what's occurring in family court have been ousted, retaliated against, defamed. They even go after reporters In the United Kingdom, for example, I think at the beginning of last year, the they ruled by law that family courts must open up to reporters and researchers, and they were forced to. But once the reporting that came out was so horrendous, they immediately closed them down and effectively threatened and retaliated against reporters in ways that they could not report anymore. I've heard that there are some small recourses being used against that, but that's a situation in the UK where the problem is a lot less, where this has been going on perhaps 15, 20 years, whereas in the US it has been going on for 40 years and more, and yet the courts remain closed. In the UK, when they had something like 44 child deaths directly attributable to family court, they were up in arms. And in the United States, that documented number is nearing 1,000, and yet nothing much has happened here. That is 1,000 murders that may have been avoided if they did not get into family court.
That is pretty sad.
And just
Go ahead, Maryann.
it's,
Excuse.
I think a lot of this is because these judges are not looking at the evidence. They don't want to hear the evidence. They want to get this case over with and move on to the next one that they can. I don't want to say what I was going to say, but these attorneys are also
Oh God.
adding to this as well. I think I had told you as soon as I set foot into family court, the first thing the opposing said is she's mentally ill and she's alienating the kids from the father. And I'm like, what? It's like, but they ran with it. The judge didn't say, wait, where's the evidence of that? They're
The
not
first
doing their
time I
job.
heard parental alienation, I thought, oh, that's abuser psychology. They think that they have a blind spot about what they've done wrong. I have done my career working with violent offenders in maximum security prisons. You enter the prison, there are no perpetrators there. They are all victims in their own minds. If they did not have this mentality, they would not perpetrate in the heinous ways that they have. Uh, so that would be immediately recognizable in criminal court. But in family court, because the public does not recognize that domestic violence and child abuse is extremely common. In fact, the latest CDC, the most comprehensive Centers for Disease Control and Prevention results showed 1 in 4 children are battered to the point of it leaving a mark, and 1 in 5 children are sexually assaulted. 1 in 8 have seen their mother being battered, and of course, violence against women is much more common, something like 1 in 3. So, so family violence is extremely common and dangerous because even if a stranger assaulted you or if you were in a war zone, you would be able to escape from that violence once you enter the home.
Mhm.
But when it's occurring in the home, uh, the violence is much more traumatic and just as dangerous and life-threatening. So this is what commonly the public does not recognize. And family courts make use of that very rosy image of family courts and people imagining a family court judge being like Judge Judy,
Mhm.
not the kind of organized criminals who seem to be occupying family courts. In fact, many of the personality disorders that I have been able to assess in judges are quite blatant and include sadistic personality disorders, psychopathic personality.
Mhm.
In other words, they are targeting human life deliberately for their own pleasure. And just like abusers taking positions with in schools and in Boy Scouts, with even with Olympic teams,
Mm-hmm.
uh, they seem to be taking positions in family court in order to carry out their abuse. And
I
this is an
believe that.
extremely dangerous trend that I've only been able to assess because I have been in it, initially by a personal case. My own sister's case in divorce court completely caught me by surprise. And then when I investigated more deeply, the only place I compare family courts to is maximum security prisons, where the complete concealing of what goes on inside of them from the public allows those in power to commit all kinds of atrocities against the powerless and voiceless. In other words, gang rapes, gladiator fights, murders go unpunished in prisons, unfortunately. And people may have the preconception that whatever happens there happens by necessity because the inmates are violent. What I find often is the case is that when there is complete lack of transparency and accountability, it's the prison guards who are actually more violent than the inmates. And so what we're finding with the family courts is that oftentimes the judges and the judge's own coterie of appointees, guardians ad litem, evaluators, they are more violent in terms of allowing for injuries and trauma, even death of children than even the family member who is the perpetrator. But they can use the fact that there's a perpetrator to their advantage because it becomes an adversarial system where there's one party against the other and the judge is supposed to be the neutral arbiter. So it's a very easily exploitable situation when the judge is not neutral, when the judge is not impartial, which is the whole point of having a judge to come in and arbitrate, but rather sides with the criminal and the perpetrator, which is the vast majority of cases. In fact, almost all family court cases I find, which is why I have called for the abolition of family courts. In fact, now, fortunately, there seem to be legislators who are catching on and calling for the entire immediate closure of family courts. That's something that's happening in Arizona that I've heard.
That sounds very good from what I've experienced. And the judges in my case were not impartial. It's like they came, everybody ganged up on me. Even I feel like some of my own paid attorneys, they worked against me, I believe. I believe that they worked against me.
Yes, that is not an uncommon experience. And you are not incorrect in your suspicions and probably correct evaluations. So that is actually the setup. It's not difficult to figure out what's happening in family courts because it's a very set playbook, as I've said. Every family is different and every dynamic has its own unique features, but family court makes them all uniformly the same.
Okay.
In other words, the accuser, the good parent who is concerned for the child's safety, is the one who against whom the tables are turned, who are accused of other kinds of abuse that are not known to occur in isolation. For example, alienating the other parent does occur, but it usually occurs when the abuser does it. The abuser is actually accusing their victim of alienation in order to perpetrate predatory alienation against that parent. And that holds true also for family court. They're making the accusation against the victim so that they too can engage in predatory alienation in order to essentially steal the child and sell the child to the perpetrator who has much more at stake, who is willing to pay a lot more, and they can also use that excuse to involve a lot more court appointees, evaluators, supervisors, and others whom they can order the victim to pay, even though they are not doing their jobs and are going against the victim. So it's actually a very perverse perversion of the court process, as they are violating every
Yeah.
constitutional due process clause, equal
Mhm.
protection clause, and rules of evidence that you can imagine. In fact, they're entirely unmoored from the law because they can be.
That's true. And in my case, I had four different judges and three guardian ad litems.
Mm.
The opposing side kept the same attorney for all of the years of the case. So that particular attorney was very familiar with the case and what was happening. They never changed attorneys.
Typical.
And when I tell you, when I was in there as a pro se litigant, even though I was the plaintiff, the opposing counsel was running the show.
Mhm.
Yes, and the judge probably parroted all the words of the opposing counsel.
I have to say that last judge, most of the time, that did not happen with the last judge
Mm-hmm.
because that particular judge came in on the end of everything after all of the damage had been done. But that last judge, I must say, even though there's over 100 years, a judge has never been disciplined in South Carolina. I must be honest, that judge, that one judge did not allow that perpetrator to do everything that they wanted to do. But the other ones prior to the last judge, they allowed that person to do any and everything they wanted to.
Yes. Well, your opponent probably did not need to change attorneys because the attorney was entirely in line with the court and in line with the perpetrator's agenda, whereas you probably had attorneys who were trying to defend you, or that you objected to their cooperating with the court in ways that you did not wish to allow.
That's right. They were cooperating with the court. When I look back at it, none of them were really defending me because one attorney that was involved in the case stole the file after the initial divorce hearing. They took the whole file and walked away with it. And I've never seen that file to this day.
Oh my.
Can we talk a little bit about this forensic exam? Can we explain to the audience exactly what a forensic exam is? This is the second test that I was ordered to take.
Yes. So usually forensic psychiatrists or psychologists or the counselor you hired, who was still a doctorate and clinically trained to act as a psychologist, they do an evaluation of you, a psychological evaluation, and assess if there are any barriers to your parenting. And then the rest is for the court to decide.
The
Courts,
second person was court appointed, I believe, or either the opposing counsel picked out this person. I didn't know the person that was, administering the forensic exam, but from what I understand, they work in the courts a lot in South Carolina.
courts generally appoint psychiatrists or psychologists. Usually, various parties can recommend an expert, or they have a list of experts from which they might choose in order to ensure that the expert is neutral. But that only works if the judge is neutral. And in your case, you were given an evaluator who was appointed either by your opponent's recommendation or the judge's own pool. of a very tight-knit group of evaluators, because there are not many evaluators, at least so far. The numbers seem to be increasing, but there are not many qualified evaluators who would blatantly put out a fraudulent report. That's why they had to go to so many non-doctorate so-called experts who are poorly trained, who usually would not even be admitted as experts at all in any other court. But in family courts, they are routinely admitted as so-called experts, and then they may make $500,000 doing a report with barely a master's degree, which is about 10 times, 100 times actually of my fees. So, and I, as a fully trained psychiatrist with trained in some of the best institutions. So, and it's only in family court. I've done about 200 cases nationwide, and it's only in family court where they would raise objections to me, usually something about my qualifications. So that gives you a sense of what family courts considered qualified versus not. So it's the reverse of what other courts considered qualified versus not. So however you were assigned this custody evaluator, they probably had some kind of conflict of interest.
Mm-hmm.
And seeing from, well, custody evaluations in general are not done by mental health experts. The honest psychologist or psychiatrist will say that we're not trained to do a custody evaluation. No program trains for this. This is what family courts are supposed to decide. If there are no barriers to your parenting, they have no constitutional right to withhold your child from you. But they've decided that they want to, because they have no constitutional right to do so, they decided that they would hold these custody evaluations where the evaluator will decide whether or not who the child should go to, even though there are no barriers against the other parent having full parenting, if not sole parenting. So, so that's the general role of the custody evaluator. So custody evaluation alone should raise red flags, but a family court appointed custody evaluator has a set agenda. And I find that the forensic report that you submitted that has been completed by this court-appointed so-called expert is very typical of custody evaluations, in that they are not based on professional clinical evaluations. They rely a great deal on subjective impressions. They, just as in your case, they were willing to state that, I mean, they excluded your history of post-traumatic stress disorder altogether, even though you were evaluated, as which should have been evidence of trauma and therefore abuse. It should implicate your ex-husband, not you. But
Mm-hmm.
they have cleverly turned it around because they know very well what PTSD looks like. They turn it around into a mental illness that would require you to see a psychiatrist, be on medication, and therefore whether or not you should have your children is questionable. Whereas the actual perpetrator, who usually has severe personality symptoms, presents very well because all they do is meet with them maybe for 15 minutes. How long did your custody evaluator meet with you?
It was a test that took 2 days, I believe. There was an initial interview, and then we had to get on the computer and take all these computerized tests for 2 days.
Yes. And how long did the evaluator meet with you?
It was a couple of hours at first on
Okay.
that initial interview.
So this was done a little more properly. I've seen too many evaluations where they meet with the parents for 15 minutes at each, meet with the child for 5 minutes. This is especially Dr. Byron Caverly in Connecticut, who churns out these evaluations. She's done about 1,000 of them.
Oh,
She sees
wow.
the parents for 10 or 15 minutes, the child for 5 minutes, and her 120-page reports are all identical, very nearly so,
Oh,
and
God.
contain very little clinical professional evaluation in them. Uh, in other words, they're filled with gibberish.
Mhm.
Your report is not to that degree, but it is enough to that extent that it would raise alarms for another professional evaluator, for another expert. In fact, I'm now taking part in the Institute of Forensic Science. It's an institute that has been formed by a victim litigant himself, um, uh, who has gone through everything you've experienced. And by the way, even though most victims are women, when the male is a victim of abuse, then the child goes to the mother. So it shows that it's not just patriarchy that's driving uh, the decision of where the child goes. It's the abuse, that they go to the abuser.
Mm.
And so he's organizing, I believe, peer reviews and reviews conducted by qualified forensic evaluators, psychiatrists and psychologists, including myself, in order to determine whether the court-appointed evaluator is doing things correctly. It's unfortunate that it's come to this extent, but
Mhm.
because the vast majority of court-appointed evaluations are false, if not fraudulent,
Mhm.
they have come to need this level of review. And reviews are increasing in the courts themselves also. Someone such as yourself may have your custody evaluation be reviewed by an independent expert to see if it was properly done. And the vast majority coming out of family court turn out not to be properly done.
I'm not an expert, but I know that that second report was not proper.
Yes,
I experienced it for the end of the report to say that I need further psychological help when no significant psychological issues arise on either report. There's something wrong with that report.
absolutely. You should be able to get what is called a peer review by a qualified forensic evaluator to be able to see what was wrongly done. And I can immediately see from the key words, basically, that you have an anxiety disorder without mention of any trauma, and that you've been alienating the child from the other parent without any finding of actual abuse on your end. In fact, there was only finding of abuse on his end.
I
And
didn't
yet,
have custody. I didn't have custody of the child. But before I was able to get back in court as a pro se litigant, I was alienated. It would be months at a time where I would not be able to see my child.
that's right. That is what abusers do.
Mhm.
So in
But they
fact,
said the test states that I was not an alienated parent, but I was an alienated parent when I
that's
had the other lawyers hired as counsel, when I had no way of speaking for myself.
Mhm.
It would be months at a time when I would not get to see my child.
yes, that is very typical. And that is the reason for the accusation, the false accusation of parental alienation in order to engage in actual predatory alienation on the part of the perpetrator and the courts. And the courts have found it much more lucrative and profitable to partner with the perpetrator than to administer justice, which is the problem of family courts. In fact, there's someone who investigated the history of family courts going back 120 years. They have never operated properly. In fact, they have always abused discretion and abused their power to do malevolence against children and not the benevolence they were empowered with these exceptional authorities to do.
The child is grown now. This case is over, but I want the public to know what can happen. I believe that's why I was allowed to become a pro se litigant, so that I can tell it all.
Mhm.
So that these people can be prepared before they go into family court, so they can know what they're fighting up against, because I did not know. I
That's
was
right.
thinking, because I have a hired counsel, I'm going to court, everything is going to be fine. But that's not the way it turned out.
Yes. In fact, you have to be extraordinarily vigilant, because by the time you find out what is actually happening, uh, you're already in you're already trapped in a difficult situation. So they're counting on litigants not understanding that this is actually not a court of law. And the lack of transparency, the reason why courts were designed to be open to the public from the very inception of this country is because these kinds of abuses happen when courts are closed. And there is no court as closed as family court, with no jury, no outside oversight, unlimited discretion to the point where appeals are seldom successful or possible. And and all other court cases are designed to funnel back to this one judge, to family court. For example, if a criminal court case opened, they would usually be funneled back to family court because there's already a case going on there, and which allows for no oversight or independent investigation to be done. And Child Protective Services is usually hand in hand with family court. They're controlled by the family courts because they work together all the time. It's not an independent investigative agency. And you did very well to go pro se.
Mhm.
Thank you
Going
so
pro
much.
se,
It was hard.
But
yes.
the pro se is fortunate because they can get things onto the record. Where if you have an attorney representing you that's trying to torpedo your case and you don't know it, get it on the record. And I'm glad you brought up CPS, Dr. Bandy, because I had them involved in my case. And whatever they say, the judge goes with. And I don't know if parents know this, but I was warned ahead of time that whatever this caseworker, who just had a degree in child development, you know, that was it. Not, yeah. And he took it and they ran with that. And that's how all that came about. So parents don't realize this.
I used to think that Child Protective Services getting half their cases wrong was due to incompetence. But now that I've seen, whenever they're involved with family court, they get 100% wrong
Hmm.
or close to it, 99.99% wrong. It's not an accident. And there are CPS workers who have told me that the judge told them what to do. The judge tied their hands. In fact, I heard that several times of a particular judge, um, that the judge tied their hands.
I would like to say, at the end of the day, Dr. Lee, just for my sake, does any report show that I have a psychological problem?
Well, the forensic evaluator left it vague enough that you can decipher from his evaluation how he got everything wrong and did not assess your anxiety symptoms as being part of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a normal response to abnormal circumstances. In other words, it's not you who is the problem. It's whatever happened to you, the violence that was perpetrated against you. So that's what they needed to investigate. And yet, that's the number one problem, red flag that they needed to investigate was left untouched. And they simply stated that your ex-husband seemed fine, did not have any overt problems, but none of this can be really evaluated simply by interviewing him. That's essentially what they did, and take his evidence into account, your evidence into account, and said it was, equally split. Whereas they should have detected the pattern of abuse, because it's so common and it's so clear when it manifests, which makes clear that they knew what was happening, and they used their training, what have you, to flip the narrative, as the family court usually commissions these so-called experts to do. It's not an accident.
Mhm. And I'm sorry that happened to you, Evelyn.
Thank you. I just wanted the world to know, because I have been painted as a crazy person by the family court and by someone that abused me.
Mhm.
And
Yes,
I'm not crazy.
usually I would say that for those who know family courts, that should be a badge of honor, because the healthier you are, the more loving a parent you are, and the more capable you are, especially if you have professional, personal capabilities that are great strengths, the more they will label you, the more aggressively they will label you as mentally ill. It's kind of the Darvo effect. Whenever you're accused, you deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. And the more capable and correct the victim is, the more you will be persecuted
Mhm.
and labeled the opposite.
And I would like to state I am a surgical technologist of 23 years in August. Team lead.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Team lead on the job. I don't think a person that's mentally ill would be capable of doing that type of work.
Yes, and that is the typical outcome.
Mhm.
That usually before entering family court, the mother is praised for their parenting, for their professional accomplishments. They may have millions of dollars in the bank, have several homes that they themselves have bought, and yet once they enter into family court, they're incompetent even to raise their own child. It makes no sense at all,
Mhm.
unless you figure out their motives and unfortunately, what I've been calling a culture of psychopathy that is happening in the family courts. In
Mhm.
other words, the structure of almost unlimited power by these powerful judges against the most vulnerable members of society needing protection, namely innocent children and mothers, has allowed for a culture of psychopathy and exploitation to take root. And
And
that is why it's so dangerous
it's
that family courts
dangerous.
need to be exposed. And I
Yes.
commend you for your work
Thank
in.
you. And I thank God. I would like to say that I was able to get into that courtroom as a pro se litigant. I fought hard. I stayed up many nights. I did much research to find out what was happening. As I said, my child is grown now, but I want to stand in the forefront to help other parents that have to go in there unsuspecting and that are not aware of what is actually happening.
Yes. I often say that the label is the problem, family and court.
Mm.
Uh, Family suggests that they are actually working to help families when in fact they destroy families in unprecedented ways in people's lives, such that it becomes the greatest catastrophe to ever befall them. And court, they are not courts of law. As I said, I consider them anti-courts because they're entirely unmoored from the law, do not follow any constitutional or legal procedure as required in any other court of law, and they absolutely ignore all evidence, ignore expertise. They hire their own non-experts. It used to be non-experts into being experts. After a lot of criticism, they've now turned to compromised or corrupt experts, but unqualified all the same.
Most definitely and sadly true. Um, is there anything else you'd like to add, Evelyn?
I'm honored to have this opportunity, Dr. Lee and Maryann Petri. We have to carry this mantle. These things have to be exposed. That's the only way things are going to change and get better.
Mhm. And I appreciate you speaking out. And how can people reach you, Evelyn, if they have any questions?
I do have a website, Evelyn, the Domestic Violence Advocate at uniweb.com. My email address is ETA, Evelyn, ETA Advocate, LLC at gmail.com. And they can reach me on Facebook also under Evelyn Hemphill or either Evelyn the Advocate LLC.
Great. And I will put Dr. Bandy Lee's information as well as bandylee.com. So I thank you both for coming on and clearing all of this up. Uh, don't jump off, okay?
Thank you.
Okay, Slam the Gavel is a podcast to help the public understand what really goes on in these courtrooms. I'm your host, Maryann Petri. You can find me on Spotify, YouTube. Please like and subscribe, Apple, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Google, and other platforms. Again, feel free to buy me a coffee to help keep this podcast going. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Lee and Evelyn Hemphill, for coming on and discussing this that every parent needs to know. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much for having us.